My name is Erik Hatlestad. I'm the Director of Rural Cooperative Energy at CURE. CURE is a rural nonprofit organization working statewide on important issues facing rural America. One of those important issues is protection and the practice of democracy in rural Minnesota. CURE calls this the Minnesota Rural Democracy Project. Today we have the pleasure of talking with Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon about voting in the upcoming election. Secretary Simon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
So you've really got a long and storied resume of working in service to the people of Minnesota. You grew up in Minnesota. You got your law degree from the University of Minnesota. You've been in private practice. You were in the Minnesota House of Representatives representing your hometowns. You were the Minnesota Assistant Attorney General, and for the past 10 years, you've been on the job as the Secretary of State of Minnesota. So I know your office has many critical duties and responsibilities that many of us, but for many of us, your role in managing Minnesota's elections and protecting Minnesota's vote tops that list. Today you're here in Granite Falls, here to talk to area residents about the upcoming election, and there's plenty to talk about. So we Minnesotans, of course, take our right to vote very seriously and our obligation to vote very seriously. So, and I think that's a huge point of pride for Minnesotans. What do Minnesotans and the people of rural Minnesota need to know about the upcoming election and your role in making this another great success as a part of Minnesota's tradition of strong voter turnout?
Well, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it. And here we are, just a matter of weeks from the general election. It's going to be an intense time. It already is, as are most presidential elections, right? They're intense because people tend to have strong feelings about the candidates. It can be even more intense when people perceive that there's a close election, which they very much do right now. And then there's an added ingredient that we in Minnesota, I think, enjoy, which is that we love to vote in this state. We are really, really good at it, regardless of zip code, regardless of background. In most places and pockets of the state, we vote in sky-high numbers compared to the rest of the country. 3 out of the last 4 elections, Minnesota has been #1 in America in voter turnout. And that is something that's really extraordinary. So our goal this year is to get us back to #1. We want to be #1. We want to be tops. And it's not just about bragging rights and being #1 for the sake of it. It's that we want every eligible voter to be able to vote and to vote. Who they vote for, that's none of my business. Or what their political leanings are, none of my business. But regardless of background or zip code or politics, that's what we want, that's what I want. So between now and Election Day, we are going to be focused very hard on that goal. And so we have a newly unveiled voter outreach and education program called Here We Vote Minnesota, because here in Minnesota we do vote in really high numbers. And it's about getting the right information, the accurate information in the hands of voters. So half the battle oftentimes, in my experience, is just to make sure that people know what the rules are, know what the law is. How can they vote? Where can they vote? Are they even eligible to vote? What does voter registration mean? What do I need to produce or bring? When can I do it? Where can I do it? Those kinds of things. So we have a website. I'm going to repeat this a couple times. It's mnvotes.gov, mnvotes.gov. It's a great one-stop shop for all of the things I just mentioned and more. On that website, you can register to vote. On that website, you can order an absentee ballot to come to you so you can vote from home. On that website, you can figure out what or who is on the ballot where you live. In case you're wondering, hey, I know we have a presidential election going on, everyone knows that, but are we voting this year in my area for county commissioner, or is the state senate up this year, or what's going on? What else is going to be on my ballot? You can do that. So there's so much you can do there. Questions can be answered there, and I'll leave it at that for now, except to say we're ready. I'm an optimist about being in the democracy business. And it's a team sport. We rely on our partners in the counties and cities and townships. They are primed and ready as well. And I have every expectation that we'll have a great outcome, not just in terms of turnout, but in terms of an election that's well run, that's honest, that's accurate, that's secure.
Absolutely. And I think the what you're talking about and making sure everyone knows the rules is such a critical part of election protection, and making sure that we continue our strong tradition as a state that prides itself on voting. What are some of the risks that you see, things like emerging AI
Yeah.
or different kinds of, people trying to, make your job harder and telling
Right.
the truth about the rules about
Yes.
how to vote?
I would say the number one problem, the number one threat to a good, clean, fair election this year is this sort of cloud of disinformation that for the last few years has spread far too wide over not just our country, but even in our state to some extent. And just for the benefit of your viewers, when I talk about disinformation, I am not talking about disagreement. It is not disinformation for someone to disagree with me or you or anyone else on policy, on performance, on anything else. That's as American as apple pie. That's what we do in a democracy. We disagree a lot. That's not disinformation. Disinformation to me means the intentional spread of knowingly false information about what the system is, not what it ought to be, because we should always be discussing and debating what it ought to be. And good, reasonable, honest people could have a difference of opinion from me or you or anyone else on any of those things. But let me give you an example. So you mentioned that obviously we oversee the election system. But here's something we don't do. We have a lot of duties, but here's one of them that we don't have. We do not count votes in our office. We don't lay a finger on anyone's ballot, ever. That happens in townships, in cities, in counties across Minnesota, in 3,000 or more places. That's by design. It's intentional. There's no one pinch point or choke point, right? Totally decentralized. So we're not in that business at all. We report what other people count, but we don't do the counting. Okay. So the disinformation part is, it would take you about 60 seconds doing a creative Google search to find folks out there who, for political reasons, are saying things, saying or implying that I, and not just me, but like my colleagues across the country, are quietly scheming in back rooms with our secret algorithms, plotting and scheming to spike the vote totals for the candidates we like and depress the vote totals for the candidates we don't like. That is disinformation. That's not just a difference of opinion or somebody who criticizes me or whatever. That's all always on the table. But like, we don't do that. It's literally something we don't do. I don't even know how I would do that. I mean, we can't do it. We don't do it. We won't do it. So that's the kind of thing I mean by disinformation. And this stuff gets spread. And you'd be surprised how it gets spread. Sometimes it's people spreading it who don't know that what they're spreading is disinformation. They see something in their social media feed, or a neighbor or a friend says something that they heard, a myth or a rumor on the street, and it gets spread. The person passing it along to the next person, they don't know that it's false. They just heard it, and they're moving it along. So that is something we got to get our arms around, and I think we are. I'm an optimist about that too. There's a few things we can do. Number one is we can lead with the truth. I mean, don't just point out the false stuff. Say what the true stuff is about the system, like I just did in terms of who counts the votes. Second thing we can do is continue to work with partners. I mentioned that this is a team sport. We could not do this without counties, cities, and townships. We're all equal teammates. We all have a role to play. So up, down, and sideways, communicating, including our federal partners at Homeland Security and the FBI and others as well. And then the third thing, I think, is just to be transparent. Let people in, let people see stuff. Let them come in. They don't have to be election judges or poll workers if they don't want to, although that's a great way to do it. But come on in, take a look. Go see how the equipment is tested if you're skeptical about the equipment. Go see how the numbers are reconciled and matched up after the election and the post-election audits. This is all open to the public, so come on in. Let me just address one sub-point that you made about artificial intelligence, because that's a really hot topic, no question about it. And from where I sit, AI, or artificial intelligence, is not so much a new threat as it is a new way to magnify a very old threat. Disinformation on elections goes back to George Washington's time, right? This is not a new thing in the 21st century. AI is just a new way to amplify that stuff. And let me give you an example that at least struck me. So a few years ago, I remember seeing a copy of a paper flyer, a good old-fashioned Xerox paper flyer, that had been put in the doors of homes in certain neighborhoods in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the 2000 presidential election. That was Bush versus Gore, if you recall. So 24 years ago. And this flyer that was put in, days or close time before the election, said something like this. Not exact words, but it said, hey, big election coming up, folks, neighbors, remember, if your last name is A through L, you vote on Tuesday. If it's M through Z, you vote on Wednesday. Okay. Now that's an obvious attempt to get a certain number of people not to vote on Tuesday. And I have no idea, as I sit here, how many people fell for that in the year 2000. Maybe 0, maybe 1, maybe 100, I have no idea. But now fast forward to 2024, same attempt to misdirect and mislead voters, but now imagine it's not a good old-fashioned paper flyer anymore. Now it's a deep fake audio or video of the mayor of Milwaukee, or a popular athlete, or business person, or faith leader, or you get where I'm going with this, which is, it's just so much more authentic seeming and real seeming now. But it's the same old problem of 24 years ago and 200 years ago, right? Which is people playing games and tricks when it comes to misleading people about the rules of elections. So, you know, Minnesota has taken the lead, I think. In 2023, the legislature passed legislation that basically bans deepfake audios and videos within 90 days of an election if it's done without the permission of the person depicted, and second, if it's done for the purpose of influencing the outcome of an election. And that second one is meant to protect First Amendment speech, comedy, and parody. Like if Saturday Night Live does a sketch of a fake Harris or fake Trump, you know, AI image, obviously they're doing it for humor purposes, and that's protected speech. But basically, Minnesota has led the way. We were like the fourth state to do something like that. Now it's up to somewhere in the teens, so people are copying that approach, and we'll see if that makes a difference. It's so fresh and so new, but you know, just another reason to say that people should be watchful about what they see in terms of images and ads and all the rest, and you know, ask tough questions.
Absolutely. I'm really glad to see the state of Minnesota, you know, continuing to prove itself as a leader in defending our right to vote and, you know, defending against disinformation. I think there's a lot of really exciting things that has happened in the legislature over the last couple of years, both that, but also expanding democracy rights and making sure that more people are able to participate in elections. You talk a little bit about how Minnesota is continuing to, you know, expand access to democracy.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something really important, which is Minnesota does have a good record. You know, I mentioned we have this sky-high turnout going back not just the last 4 elections, but decades, where Minnesota has been routinely number 1, 2, 3, very top of the list in voting. And one of the ingredients there, kind of the secret sauce, is we've had good laws on the books. By the way, laws that some were put there by Republicans, some by Democrats. It's a blend, it's a mix, and they don't benefit any particular political party. And we've had them for a long time. So things like same day or election day voter registration. You know, we've had that for over 50 years in Minnesota. And it's not just some little boutique service that only a few people take advantage of. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people every election take advantage of that because maybe they moved, or maybe they had a name change, or for whatever reason, or maybe they haven't voted in a while and they need to refresh their registration. But to your point, over the last year or so, starting in 2023, there's been a new generation of reforms, and I'll tick off a few of them that passed. And by the way, every single one of these, every last one, is nonpartisan in origin and nonpartisan in effect. Meaning these are things that red states do, blue states do, purple states do. This isn't some thing depending on political party. It's all over America. We are not the pioneer here. We are not by no means the first. So I'll give a few examples. One is we, after a long debate, about 20 years worth of debate in Minnesota, back and forth, the legislature decided to restore the freedom to vote for people who have left prison behind. In other words, they've done every last day, hour, minute, second of the time in their sentence, and now they're out. And just like North Dakota's done for a generation, just like Iowa's on the way to doing, states like Nebraska, I think, Kentucky, I think, other states are heading in that direction, so did we. That's 55,000 people. They've done their time. They've done every minute of their time, but now someone said they're good enough, worthy enough, safe enough to be out. They ought to have some say, right? So that was one thing. Another thing is something called automatic voter registration, which is not quite an accurate title, in my opinion, for that reform. It's really just building off of what we've already had for over 30 years in Minnesota. And some of your viewers might recognize this. For over 30 years, we've had a motor voter law in Minnesota, which means that when you get or renew a driver's license or state ID, there traditionally was always, for 30 years, a box you could check on the form saying, hey, could you please register to me to vote also? Because the same information you're giving to get or renew a driver's license is the very same stuff you'd need to register to vote, so why not kill two birds with one stone? That's for 30 years that we had. What this law does is it just means that if you go to get or renew a driver's license, and if you are otherwise eligible, that's the key thing. You have to have proof of citizenship. You have to be 18 years of age or older. You have to be a resident of Minnesota, all the basic stuff. Only if that's true, you will be deemed to wish to register to vote unless you opt out. And you can always opt out. You'll get sent a postcard in the mail. You can opt out that way. Even after that, you could call or email or write and say, take me off the list. I'm not interested in being registered to vote. But that's another thing that not only is good in terms of access, but is good in terms of security and the integrity of the election. Why? Because this means that we're going to get people in the system far earlier than they are now, months and months and months before an election, so we can do the filtering and the screening and the checking for eligibility that we do routinely, but now we can do it earlier. So it's a great security measure as well. It's not just about access. We also have now pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, which means high school students as of the age of 16 can fill out a form. It doesn't mean they're registered, of course you can't do that, or vote till you're 18, but it means you're in line to do so, and it means that a real human being, not a computer, is going to check to make sure whoever filled out that form is who they say they are, lives where they say they live, and if that checks out, then on their 18th birthday they'll be added as a voter to the voting rolls. So that's another reform. There are many others as well, but those are some of the headline grabbers, I would say. And I think it's going to put us in an even stronger position in Minnesota. You know, we have been a leader. These are examples of things that other states have been doing for a while, so we're not literally the first state to do it by any means, but in total, by adopting those kinds of reforms, it really modernizes and strengthens the system. And I think one of the secrets in Minnesota has been, you know, at least the way I look at it is, any election system, if you were to start from scratch in Minnesota or any other state, no laws, you're just building it from the ground up. I think everyone, really, that I've ever met, they're trying to balance two things, access and security. Access meaning, hey, is it relatively reasonably easy for someone to do it? You don't want to make it an obstacle course, anything like that. Security meaning you want to make sure that only eligible voters and nobody else can take advantage of that accessibility. And I think Minnesota, over the years, regardless of who's in charge, Democrat, Republican, we've done a really, really good job of getting that balance right. There's no one perfect answer. Everyone has a different definition of what that perfect blend would be. But overall, we've had good access and we've had good security, and that speaks well of us as a state.
Absolutely. So we're, of course, quickly approaching this next election here. What are some, you're obviously known for making trips across the state, every single county, right? And talking to people about the election and about participating in our democracy. What are some upcoming dates or things that you're doing to continue spreading the word about accurate information about the election?
Well, you're right that I get around a lot. I love it. It's the best part of my job. I learned about 5 minutes into this job that the worst thing you could do, anyone, me or anyone else holding this job, is to just sit behind a desk and say vote all day. That's just a recipe for total failure. You got to get out there. We got 87 counties. We got 5.7 million people, and the best ideas come from everywhere, absolutely everywhere around the state. Things I never would have thought of, heard about, been exposed to, come from visits all over. And I'm on my 9th 87 county tour at this point, so it's been really great. But upcoming dates, we've got National Voter Registration Day coming up on Tuesday, September 17th. It is what it sounds like. It's a day when a ton of people from across the country, whether it's veterans groups or large companies or nonprofits, really focus on that day to really emphasize voter registration for folks. And remember, again, our website is mnvotes.gov. There's a place where you can register directly online. Then September 20th, just 3 days later, Friday, September 20th, that's the start of early voting or absentee voting in Minnesota. So from September 20th until Election Day, you can vote in Minnesota. You can do so one of two ways. You can vote early in person, which is typically City Hall or County Courthouse or something like that. If you don't know where that is for you, go to mnvotes.gov and put in your address and it'll come up. So that's that date. And then November 5th, Tuesday, is game day. That's the big election day, right? And so there too, everyone has an assigned polling place. And if you don't know, mnvotes.gov, just type in your address and it'll tell you where to go there. So those are the big ones coming up. And it's an exciting time. I mean, no matter where you sit or stand politically, I think when you have an election, and in particular, let's face it, presidential election, there are a lot more eyes on it, a lot more intensity, a lot more passion. And that's great. As long as it's channeled in a positive direction, hey, let's do it. That's what democracy is all about. So I think it's exciting. I'm an optimist about how it's going to go. And I'm an optimist about democracy in our state and in our country. And it's something to look forward to.
Absolutely. Well, just you brought up something that I just wanted a quick follow up on. So we, living in rural Minnesota, there's many townships who have practiced mail-in voting for a long time.
That's right.
And sometimes we hear some criticism about, there's too much mail-in voting in Minnesota, even though many parts of Minnesota have practiced it for a long time. What are you hearing from rural voters as you travel across the state about voting by mail?
Yeah, I always ask about that because it's a really interesting thing that we have in Minnesota. And just for the sake of your viewers, this was a law from 1987. 1987. So we're talking about 37 years ago, right? We've had this law for that long. And the law says this, that any size township in any city with 400 or fewer registered voters, not people, but registered voters, can decide if it wants to, and it's totally their decision. No county can tell them what to do. The state can't tell them what to do. If they and their local government decide that they want to go vote by mail only and ditch their polling places, so no more polling place, just everyone who's a registered voter gets mailed a ballot automatically every election. If that's what they want, they can do that. And we now have, last time I checked, it was about 210,000 Minnesotans, voters I should say, Minnesota voters, live in places that have that, right? And it's totally up to every community. They could go back and forth. There are a few, for example, that went that way for COVID because, people weren't crazy about congregating in places during COVID.
Right.
But then when COVID was mostly over, they went back to having polling places, and that's perfectly fine. No one's stuck in the mud or stuck in cement with your decision. They can go back and forth, and some do. But it is slowly increasing over time, the number of places that like it. And what I get is, you do have a few that like it and don't like it, but the vast majority really do like it. First, frankly, it saves money because elections can be expensive. That elections equipment is expensive. The tabulating equipment, the poll pads, all the rest. Then you got to hire and train and pay the poll workers, who we call election judges under Minnesota tradition and law. And so some of it's a money issue, but some of it is just a convenience issue that residents like the idea that they can vote from their couch or vote from their kitchen table. And again, it's available to townships of any size and cities with 400 or fewer. So if you got 401 registered voters in your city, you're not eligible for this. And I think it's worked out really, really well so far. People seem to be really pleased with it.
Absolutely. Well, Secretary Simon, at CURE, we're really proud to live in a state with such a strong history of democracy, in a state where clean and fair elections are business as usual. Thanks very much to your efforts. And voter turnout is a competitive sport. So thanks so much for coming to visit us out in Western Minnesota. And thanks for talking with CURE about the Minnesota elections.
Thank you very much. Great to be on your program and great to be back in Granite Falls.